Please.
We're recording.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It is September 13th, 2022 at 8:43 a.m. This is the meeting of the Comprehensive Land Use Plan Committee, and I call this meeting to order. We start with a roll call. Mr. Price.
Brent Rubin.
Here.
Deborah Carpenter.
Here.
Dustin Bullard. Jasmine Anderson.
Here.
Jennifer Rangel.
Here.
Jerry Hawkins.
Here.
Krista Nightingale.
Here.
Linda McMahon.
Here.
Annette Aguilar. Matt Houston.
Here.
Peter Goldstein.
Here.
Roy Lopez. All right, it's 9.
All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone. I don't believe we have any public speakers signed up for today, and we are sitting in a room with only members and city staff, so we can move past that item. Next item on our agenda is approval of the minutes from our last meeting on August 23rd, 2022. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
I move that the minutes be approved.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter, for your motion. Do we have a second? Great. Thank you, Commissioner Anderson, for your second. Do we have any discussion? All right, seeing none, all in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay. The motion carries. All right, we're going to go now back to Mr. Agu for the second part of his presentation and discussion on place type review. Oh, Mr. Price.
Good morning, Chair. Today, we're going to continue the discussion on place types. We're going to begin by reviewing some information we put together to respond to some of the specific inquiries from committee members. So that's going to kick us off for a few minutes, and then we'll continue with the review of place types. Our consultant, Brandon Nolan, is going to be guiding us through this information and through the presentation virtually. So I'm going to hand over the floor to him for the main presentation.
Great, thanks. Morning, Mr. Nolan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me again. I'll share screen. One second, here we go. All right, is that coming through?
Yes.
Okay. Again, so this is kind of part 2 of the meeting we started last month. Really wanted to kind of recap some of what was discussed with this group, and then make sure we wrapped up the draft place type discussion before we kind of move into the next step, which is starting to map these out in more detail and then really start to frame out a land use plan for the city. So a few minutes to recap some of the issue areas that were discussed last time. We want to make sure you guys understand that we're trying to really take your commentary seriously and respond appropriately. Also want to clarify, I think, what the place types are kind of capable of responding to versus maybe what the land use plan as a whole can do. So in reviewing comments from last discussion, here's a kind of an image on the right of the mirror board with some of the notes we were taking. But talking with PUD staff, really thought the comments kind of fell into 3 buckets. One, kind of discussion of land use conflicts, especially regarding environmental justice. 2, equity and historic disparities, kind of recognizing past decisions and the impacts on kind of present day. And then also kind of a more minor component, but how we talk about supporting uses within a place type and avoiding kind of internal land use conflicts. So we really want to make sure that the equity concern is not, make it known that the equity concern is not being ignored. There's a lot of information inside the existing conditions report that you all have seen that looks at the equity issue in relation to land use. And actually it was a kind of concerted effort working with the team to make sure we were having kind of equity as a kind of data component throughout every section of the existing conditions report. So we've got a couple of graphics here, but it's definitely something that's top of mind. And we want to make sure as we talk about how these place types are applied in the city and the different policies that kind of coincide with those place types, that we are recognizing that equity is kind of a concern and something that should be really helping be driving decision making. So here, this map is showing the recap areas. Obviously, you can see in the kind of predominantly in the southeast. But we were really trying to use existing conditions report to kind of document where those kind of issue areas were, and again, making sure that as we apply and create this future land use map, that we're trying to address equity moving forward. This map here is also kind of showing what we'd call kind of a complete neighborhood index, but basically the darker the color, the more amenities are available in an area. You can see kind of comparing to the previous map, especially those recap areas tend to be kind of less dense in terms of access to amenities. And so that's another kind of data point just documenting kind of historic inequities in the Dallas landscape. And so as we get into looking at land use planning, we're going to be making sure we use these data points to help kind of highlight areas of focus and make sure that we are trying to tackle some of these equity concerns head on with the language that's used in the plan and with the application of the place types. Kind of something that speaks to that would be this map here showing the kind of industrial and residential conflicts in the city. Basically, the light purple areas are your industrially zoned areas, and then you've got the reds and browns surrounding those areas, kind of showcasing where that conflict currently exists in the city. So we have documentation that highlights where those kind of environmental justice concerns are more present, where you have that kind of a budding land use conflict occurring in the Dallas landscape. And it's going to be a key area of focus in Forward Dallas to make sure we're looking at these areas more in depth and making sure that there's discussion of land use mitigation strategies, kind of long-term transition to hopefully kind of ease the tension points between those two different conflicting land uses in the future. That's not to say it's going to happen overnight, and and ideally, we're going to be looking at each of these areas in more detail with staff to be able to decide kind of which side of the line we want to encourage transitions to occur, again, to address the negative impacts of industrial being proximate and adjacent to residential uses. In one area, I think we wanted to use to kind of highlight kind of how this plays out within the place type discussion and land use planning is the Trinity River corridor. West Dallas is an area where we can see that industrial and residential conflict kind of playing out. This is kind of zooming in a portion of the river corridor plan. It's a little granulated because that corridor plan didn't have really detailed graphics. So this is kind of a zoom in and a crop, but you can see kind of the Singleton Boulevard corridor and the DART station routes that are included in this plan is kind of TOD or transit oriented development centers. And so all those areas in black are meant to be what they call the urban villages in that plan. And this plan is kind of the core land use component of the more recent Trinity River corridor projects. And so this kind of provides the baseline for land use planning and along this corridor. We've underlined or underlaid the aerial photographs so we can kind of see what those areas look like. If we zoom in on one of these urban villages, so this one's kind of right in the middle of this corridor, you zoom in, I mean, this is an area where you all know, I mean, there's a lot of residential development starting to pop up. We're starting to see a transition here again. So the idea being DART station in the middle, creating this kind of walkable urban environment with a mix of uses. But you can see in this aerial, kind of obviously the larger industrial kind of on the west end, the kind of scattered kind of neighborhood residential historically that is located in the area, and then some transitioning that's happening with some more intense, more kind of urban type residential development with multifamily occurring on some of these more vacant sites. So here you can see kind of that urban village concept that was identified years ago gradually playing out with those conflicts being transitioned away because the city has said, this is our policy. We want to encourage this type of use mix in this area. And we want to basically kind of usher out some of these industrial conflicts and usher in more of this TOD or transit-oriented development district kind of concept in this area. So,
May I ask a question here?
yeah, absolutely.
Where you're saying transit-oriented development and dark rail line, as far as I mean, my home is within this box. And so I'm pretty familiar with this area, and
Sure.
there's no dark rail line.
No. Yeah, sorry. This is a future. I mean, this is a plan from a few years back, but the idea was that long term in this plan, they're highlighting several kind of future extensions of DART service to this area.
Yeah, but I mean, long term might be 60 years or something like that. Okay, I mean, all
Sure.
right.
Yeah, and I can't speak to the, I guess, the likelihood or the timeline on those, but I guess the thing we wanted to hone in on is the kind of the idea that these areas are starting to become nodes for more intense kind of urban development and less industrial.
Right. Well, definitely, it's changing away from.
Yeah.
But it's not what I would consider a classic transit-oriented development.
No.
That's a heavy freight railroad.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, sorry, didn't mean to put a pin on the TOD piece of it. I think, yeah, but more so kind of on what's happening with land uses. And I also want to recognize, we know that with this transition, there's also concerns about displacement. And that's something that it both in the place type descriptions and in the kind of broader land use text, we want to make sure we're underscoring the need to kind of adhere to other city policies that are in other adopted documents, and also discuss the need to kind of continue to evaluate tools to avoid displacement. So looking at things like land trusts or co-ops, for example, as a way of preserving kind of the current resident population, but also welcoming in new investment into these areas. As we transition the industrial out, something has to take its place. But we also want to make sure that the current residents aren't being pushed out as well. So we think this is an area that kind of highlights all those conflicts happening at once. And again, long-term, the land use policy can kind of establish or reinforce policies that preserve kind of existing residents, but also promote new investment. Any questions or I guess this further discussion on that piece? And I think we can get, as we start to talk about the place types, we can come back to some of these kind of transition areas as well. But I think, again, I just want to underscore that I think last week when we were talking about land use conflicts, or last month, and transitions, I think there was a couple different conversations happening at the same time. This is an area where we're talking about long-term transitioning from industrial to something else to kind of get rid of the conflict that exists and improve quality of life.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan. Let me just note for the record that Mr. Lopez arrived at 5:54 a.m. And members, do any of y'all have questions for Mr. Nolan? Ms. Rangel.
Thank you, Chair Rubin. Along with another data point, are you all going to provide a displacement risk index as part of the existing conditions?
That's not something we had talked about. I don't know if I guess the status, maybe Lawrence or Brian could speak to the status of the existing conditions report, and where we stand with that report. We are definitely looking at doing additional analyses, whether it's part of that report or just part of our due diligence of planning moving forward. So we can definitely discuss doing some kind of displacement risk index. I think we have to look at kind of what are the factors that feed into that. And I don't know if we have an example kind of currently that we'd be mimicking to be able to do that index. So I think we'd be happy to, if you want to point us in the direction of a resource to look at, we'd be happy to take a look.
Mr. Aguz, the microphone for those of y'all who can't see online.
Okay, y'all heard me? I'm sorry. This is Lawrence. Jennifer, can you repeat the displacement index that you're mentioning?
Yes, so if you are going to create, is the City of Dallas going to create a map that also shows the displacement risk index for the city of Dallas? Because I heard mentioned about, that this Forward Dallas is going to have suggestions about how to mitigate displacement. So I think as we look into that in the future, it's important to have a foundation map where we could point to, okay, this is the analysis of the displacement risk index. And there's some examples online. I don't know if you all had taken a look at them.
No, we can definitely use the examples that you have. Currently, the existing conditions report that we have has other analyses and other indices that we've used to kind of tell the same story, but we would definitely like to have or see what you're referencing, and then we can add that to our report. And what we also want to do is we'll be sharing that draft report with you all, the technical review committee they're reviewing. You all will be getting that link too as well to also add to the review.
This is Linda McMahon. I think the housing department is approving a contract this Wednesday at council to have a displacement risk assessment done.
This is Andrea Gillis, Assistant Director of Planning and Urban Design, and that's exactly what I was going to say. Through the housing department, this work is being done, and we're working very directly with the housing department as different recommendations relate to housing and any anti-displacement issues.
Okay, but at some point you're going to overlay that study that they're commissioning this week and into this work. So thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and there's definitely an opportunity, I think, to use some of the data that's already been collected in that effort too. I mean, we've already created what we call kind of a land to improvement ratio map that kind of shows kind of what's the value of the land versus the value of the structure that's on the land, and that kind of highlights areas where there's definitely a kind of potential for that kind of redevelopment to kind of happen based on just market dynamics. So I could quickly imagine if you take that information and intersect it with kind of resident incomes, you'd be able to see kind of who's at risk, kind of in areas where that transition is kind of anticipated to occur just based on current market value. So we can definitely kind of work across teams to get that done.
Thank you. And I have one more question. If you could go back to, I think maybe slide 7, the one that shows the industrial zoning. Okay, so does that map include sub-districts of PDs that might be IR, IM, LI, or CS?
I believe this is just the kind of standard zoning and not PDs. Lawrence, do you recall?
Right, it's the base zoning is what we're looking at here.
Yeah.
It might be helpful to, I know it's a lot of PDs, of course, but I think when we look at PDs in the city, there's also some sub-districts that are standalone CS, LI, IM, and may also present some conflicts too in those PDs that are honestly a catch for all different land uses that might be at conflict too. So it might be important to look at that as well, not just, the traditional zoning districts.
No, that's a good point. Our team actually looked at the top 30 in terms of land mass PDs to kind of get a general idea of what those were telling us, because there are 1,000 PDs, so that's kind of how we approached it. But definitely your comment makes sense in terms of looking at PDs and the base zone.
I follow up on that, just so I understand where the city is with its data today. Is it easy for the city to find out within PDs what the base of the PD is or the base of sub-districts and map that? Or is that something that requires?
You have to go into each PD document text to find that. So that's how we would be doing that exercise, and that would take a long time.
There are a number of PDs that were written, I know, in West Dallas specifically to place industrial use closer to residential neighborhoods than the base code would otherwise allow.
And it may be worth looking at areas where we know that those problems already exist first, so we can get that incorporated into a map.
And I just want to emphasize, we are absolutely making that a priority of identifying these areas where we do have one, known industrial residential conflicts, but then also where we just doing the analysis and understanding that the zoning over time and working with different departments where those issues are. So this is absolutely a priority for the future land use map to address some of those issues. And I think we can even it will be helpful. We have to remember that this is guidance, so that in some of these areas that we know this, we can give that big picture guidance that will direct some of those future changes to get into the weeds of the PDs and all of those details.
Yeah, there's an enormous PD West Dallas that sort of goes from where the auto pound is, west where Trinity Cement, it's for quarrying and mining. Maybe, I don't know if it's PD 29, I don't remember the number, but it covers just an enormous number of acres.
A huge swath.
Right.
Just to add the one thing, this meeting and subsequent meeting, we're going to be looking at identifying some of those focus areas for you all to have give more input in terms of the locations that we're investigating and want to have a deeper dive into. So I think we're going to be continuing that conversation the latter half of this meeting and then the next meeting that we have too as well.
Additional
Question, Chair.
Is that
This is
Mr.
Mr.
Hawkins?
Yes.
Yep. Please.
Mr. Nolan, can you turn to, can you go back to page, I think it's maybe page 2 or 3. Actually, it's I think it's page 6. I think you went to page 6. So I know you mentioned that you all were making like quantitative data a point when it comes to equity in this report, but I think we're still missing the why and the how. You know, on page 7 it said industrial uses were close to residential neighborhoods that are Black and brown, but there's no why and the how. How do we get that information? I think this is I think maybe after like 3 or 4 subsequent meetings, we've asked for some of the why and the how, some of those policies that can inform this guidance, because this report is guidance according to city staff. So how can the folks who are making this be guided if we don't have the why and the how?
Right, this is Lawrence. I can answer that question. So in terms of the why and the how, in terms of our analysis in the ECR report, I mentioned that we'll be sending that to you all later today. That's the same document that our technical review committee they're reviewing. So you can see the entire report in its entirety and provide comments on that too as well. And what this is showing, this presentation is very high level snapshot. So it doesn't delve into that why and how as in depth as you're asking, but we'll provide that information, that link to you today.
And I think that's the question I'm asking. Why I don't think my question is, why wouldn't the why and the how be high level, particularly if we are doing a new report to provide better guidance, if that makes sense.
Repeat that one more time. Sorry.
Now, I know you said this is a high level report, and I'm asking why wouldn't the why and the how, those policy points from the past,
why and how is not evident in this presentation?
Yeah, I'm just asking why wouldn't they be high level?
Oh, I guess those are high level, but we can put those front and center for you to see in this presentation and the report, if it's not as explicit as you're asking for.
All right, members, did you have further questions, Mr. Hawkins, or?
I think that's it for now. I just think that those, you know, as we see quantitative data, we should also see that qualitative data, and those things are extremely important. I think, you know, in the last few weeks, there have been a couple of plans, including the city racial equity plan, that did include any high level qualitative data with policy, actual policy in it. And so folks are pretty frustrated. I think it's really important for us to, if we bring a high level presentation to include some of those very specific and explicit policy points that we are trying to correct and provide guidance for the future planning.
All right, members, Commissioner Carpenter.
Yeah, I have a question about something you said in regard to transitions, you know, adjustments that need to be made when you have residential and industrial adjacency, and that staff was, if I understood this correctly, staff was looking at which side of the line where they want these adjustments to be made to have a better transition. And I know the mistake that I think that was made the last time we did a zoning overlay was the single family neighborhoods that were adjusted, that were upzoned partially or were changed to a commercial zoning, that really contributed to the decay and decline of these neighborhoods because, immediately those single family homes were made non-conforming. Then you have decades past where, houses fall down, people move out. And, that now we're looking at least in the southern sector, the western sector, when we're looking at these neighborhoods that have, incompatible zoning on top of them, we have quite an issue to sort out as far as how we move forward with this. Is there a way that we can identify where these overlay transitions took place during the last comp plan? I mean, I know where some of them are in my neighborhood or, in Joppy, where we had single family neighborhoods overlaid with commercial.
Yeah, so I think, yes, we can take a look at that. I think we have some of that information. I think that's also why we have identified some of the initial focus areas, because we know that those were some of the areas where there was more conflict than some of the other areas, conflict in land uses. What I will say is, as we start, so what we're trying to do is build, right, and get to the point where we're getting some agreement on some place types, right, in a general sense, so that we can actually start showing how they get placed on a map, and then overlaying our focus areas. And I think that's where you'll start to see what we're talking about and how we can use land use from an equity perspective. Because I think those questions are specifically what we need to think about when we're saying land use equity. Is that in the past, yes, we favored in many areas commercial development or industrial development over residential. Well, maybe through this land use plan, when we're starting to layer on those place types, I don't know that it'll be all areas, but there may be some key areas where now we're prioritizing those residential uses versus those other ones. But I think that's where we need to, one, get through this generalized discussion about just place types in general, how they work, what they're looking at, what their components are, what they're going to contain. And then we can start getting into the details of, as we layer them in, what is the most appropriate way to layer them in, and how do those transitions look, and making sure that we're addressing that from the citywide perspective in an equitable way.
I just think we need to kind of daylight that
Sure.
underlying bias that has happened in the past, where when there was a conflict between industrial and residential, the residential lost every time.
Absolutely, and we completely, those are one of those pieces that and I think what we need to do, and what we've talked about as staff is, and to Mr. Hawkins' point, what we want to do in upcoming meetings is, I think we have enough information so far of what we've heard from the community as far as elevated priorities from the community so far. They will continue to evolve because the engagement is continuing. And also, we need to bring to you very clear, the sort of citywide adopted policies and priorities so far that are our guiding principles from a land use perspective as well, how they marry, where some of the links may be missing, so that we have those guiding principles from a community perspective, as well as from the citywide adopted policy perspective. And then starting to parse out some of those pieces. And then, yes, thinking about, those issues from the past and being very frank about, you're right, there were different levels of priorities at different times. And so where are we at now with the city and how we're using land use to reach those goals?
Commissioner, did you have any follow-up? Commissioner Anderson, I see your hand raised.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple questions. So initially related to what our expectations are for the communities that we're representing on the map, which include all of the communities, of course, and how we'd like to see them develop in the future. So it's kind of based in how we're defining industrial or light industrial or the various zoning characteristics in a new market today where advanced manufacturing and other industrial processes are changing. They're not like the same as they were before. And in my opinion, it's a good opportunity to begin to insert various components of industries into the communities so that those communities can be sustainable as opposed to being fully residential or fully, commercialized. We, in my opinion, should think about where the communities can go with their land use, where we would like to create a new niche or a new market, similar to inserting silicone in Silicon Valley. What community do we want to influence and how do we want to influence? And I don't know that blanket characteristics of saying we will not allow industrial adjacent to residential may be too thick of a blanket, unless we begin to kind of determine what the new industries will look like, and do they want to have do they fit into communities, or can they fit in the new communities of tomorrow? So I guess this is just based on how are we defining industrial and industrial of the future, and then are we creating overlays for the communities so that they can become sustainable themselves and not just be residential.
I think that observation's spot on. I mean, you're right. I mean, the industrial development is not all big box warehouses and smoke spewing warehouse complexes, right? I mean, it's very much changed. Makerspace, these kind of smaller scale light industrial uses are much more compatible, or so just straight up compatible with residential development now than it was in the 1960s when most of these codes were written. So that's a great example, I think, of what the place types can do to initiate some discussion and maybe kind of set the table for some changes in city policy. If we say that maker spaces and kind of R&D type uses are okay in certain residential place types, for example, or in certain commercial place types, that kind of sets the table to say, hey, we can write some code or some standards that go with these uses to make it okay to kind of integrate along maybe main streets or key intersections within these residential spaces without having an impact on residential character, but also creating kind of opportunity for local residents. So I think that's a great example of how the place types concept can really help you make that transition and be a bit more flexible where flexibility should be granted because of the shifts that have happened in kind of the landscape and how people make things in the world today. So I think we can get into that as we talk about the place types here in a couple minutes, but that's a great example.
Yeah, and I would say, I would ask if we could continue on with the presentation, because I think some of these questions might be answered as we move through the presentation and get a little bit more detail as we get some more of the weeds of the place types.
Any last quick questions, Vaughn, and then maybe we can just let the presentation go to the end and then do all the questions once we're done. All right, Mr. Nolan, thank you. Nolan.
All right. So and that kind of comment, I guess, leads into this next talking point. There was some discussion about kind of how do we guide kind of a mix of uses. When we say we're going to allow retail in certain areas, what does that mean? So the place types really do kind of recognize that neighborhoods are a mix of uses, right? And I think we talked about this last meeting. The way we are defining them in this discussion, we have what we're calling primary uses and supporting uses. So primary uses are the ones that kind of generally get along with one another, may require some minor interventions to make sure you have like good screening or landscaping just to avoid any minor land use conflicts. And then there's the supporting uses, which really could have a bit more impact, but as long as you've got good standards in place, they should be fine, and they should kind of create that vibrancy that we're looking for. And so the place types are going to use imagery and urban design callouts, which haven't been drafted yet. That's kind of the next step in this process to guide implementation, and that's going to kind of be akin to kind of what we'd call locational performance standards that would really mitigate those potential for land use conflicts. So it's language that can kind of easily be used to help inform things like changes to your zoning code, for example. So this is an example we went through last time, kind of that suburban neighborhood place type example. And if you recall, we had kind of a mix of some retail and multifamily. The retail is a great example of that supporting use that maybe has some potential for conflict, that we want to just make sure there's quality standards in place to make sure it's not, a small corner store being dropped in every single spot in the neighborhood, that you're kind of making sure you're still adhering to some good best practices in terms of neighborhood design, but allowing for that use to occur in the neighborhood. This is an example of a more polished kind of finished product we did in another community where we were promoting that kind of same kind of neighborhood node concept. So a mix of uses. We had a diagram and an illustration to kind of help show kind of how it plays out. But as part of this, we had some numbers and some kind of call outs dropped on top of this image. Those call outs are those locational standards. So number one, neighborhood centers typically located or should be located along major or minor collector streets rather than local streets or arterials. So that right away says these uses should only be located in certain spots. And so we provided a variety of kind of guidance or standards to help make sure that those uses, as they're dropped into this context, still mesh well with the surrounding neighborhood. So that's an example of kind of, as we get into the kind of end game here and really polish this document and actually have a land use document, we'll have kind of good quality imagery examples, diagrams, and illustrations to help drive home kind of what's important in which place type, and how do we address supporting land uses. So with that, we're going to continue the place type discussion, and I'll jump ahead. Recall previously, this graphic here on the right is showing the mix of place types and then those primary and supporting uses, and we're going to kind of advance to kind of where we were in the discussion last time around, which was I believe we've gotten through all the residential place types, and we had landed on kind of the mixed use neighborhood as the last one to get to. So we've got again about 13 place types here, and we've got about, I think, 8 to go through as part of today's discussion and see what kind of questions you have. So this is the neighborhood commercial / mixed use district. As you can see here, it's a little bit different than the suburban or the residential place types we were looking at previously, in that it's much more concentrated on a mix of multifamily and retail and services as those primary uses. And then supporting uses would be kind of more intense multifamily and mixed use buildings, as well as some of your supporting public and institutional facilities. Also have like hotels and office as primary uses in this place type. And again, it still has some residential kind of surrounding it, but for the most part, it's that kind of more intense neighborhood node or mixed use district that kind of helps support surrounding neighborhoods that are a different place type. And then for these commercial ones, we're going to kind of gradually ratchet up in intensity. Then we've got medium commercial or mixed use districts. These are meant to be kind of that next level of intensity above the neighborhood node, where, basically the entire place type is somewhat of a commercial district with kind of complementary multifamily development. And again, maybe some open space like an urban kind of corridor or parkway, but for the most part, more dense, more intense commercial and multifamily node that really is kind of more of a regional kind of a destination. And then ratcheting above that, you have the regional commercial, which is, the malls, the larger complexes, much more, I think, kind of monolithic in use for the most part, where we have a lot of commercial with some mixed use and some multifamily. These are the areas that really kind of anchor the entire city and are those destinations for retail. Not just the malls, though, also somewhat kind of some can be more urban village concepts, but again, that mix of uses. And here you can see the supporting uses starts to get a bit bigger. So in addition to the open space, we have transportation as kind of a key asset. Warehousing and distribution and light industrial can start to enter the picture here. This is a place type where it can serve as somewhat of a transition between some of those less intense areas, industrial to commercial to residential. And then we have the urban core. This is really kind of the highest concentration of jobs and commercial activity. It's your downtown core. You know, the most kind of intense, kind of area. You know, it's
So you're cutting in and out.
I'm cutting in and out.
If you could
Okay.
rewind by 30 seconds.
Okay, so starting with urban core, or the last one.
Starting with urban core.
Okay, sorry. So urban core is really, I mean, it's the downtown and kind of immediate surrounding blocks. It's the most intense area of the city, the most vertical, multifamily apartments, condominiums, mixed use development, some standalone retail, but mostly kind of office and mixed use, and your hotels and lodgings. And again, so private and public open space, parking can be some supporting uses, but this is the downtown, pretty straightforward. And then we start to get into some more unique place types outside of the downtown, institutional campus or special purpose. The easiest way to think about this is kind of what are the districts that exist or areas of the city that exist where you have some kind of core institutional player that's really the anchor. And if it wasn't there, the surrounding kind of complementary development wouldn't be there. It'd be something different. So, you know, regional hospitals is a great example where the hospital is the anchor for this district, and you've got some ancillary office uses. You know, the kind of supporting medical uses. Other institutional players might be in the area, and then you've maybe got some housing that's kind of supporting that district, but overall, it's anchored by this institutional campus. And then now we start to get into those industrial or employment focused place types. We're calling this one flex industry or innovation district. This is the area where I think we can start to talk about kind of how we're transitioning some of the older, maybe potentially outmoded industrial areas in the city to something it's more modern, that kind of reacts to changes in the marketplace, in addition to kind of the makerspace and some of the smaller scale things that can be embedded in the neighborhood context. These are those areas that are really accommodating a lot of employment. In some communities, we call these employment districts instead of innovation districts, but the focus is on employment generating uses and then supporting uses that go with that employment. And then industrial hub is the kind of more intense, traditional industrial, again, light industry, heavy industry, warehousing is the kind of core primary uses, supported by some more intense transportation and utilities. And then maybe you have a smattering of office and retail and commercial to kind of support those employment uses. But this is kind of the other end of the spectrum for the residential place types. Again, recognizing where those kind of place types meet, we have to talk about what transitions happen along those edges.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
As referenced in the question earlier today about the changing dynamics of what is considered to be light industrial, would you consider this flex industry innovation district to be what we're talking about here in terms of emerging industries that we may want to target? Or where would that fit, in other words?
So I think the emerging industry definitely in this lighter industrial kind of innovation district, that's where it could be accommodated for larger scale. But I think we can talk about one of the things that can be considered as part of maybe edits we're making or as part of some supplementary text that goes with this is the idea of makerspace and kind of incubator, kind of a smaller scale industrial uses. That could be a supporting use in a commercial place type. So that could be easily, integrated into the regional or medium commercial, for example. Whether or not you'd want to take it to the extent of having it included in residential neighborhoods or place types would be another just like a part of the discussion we have to have as well. So we have worked in, yeah.
A lot of live work lofts are residing in places like West Dallas, where there, a lot of the light industrial's been turned into galleries, other types of entertainment venues. So if, I don't think if you're talking about innovation areas, you should totally take out the opportunity for residential, some residential to be there, even if it's live work lofts.
Mm-hmm. And so that, I think that's an example of like, do we encourage that kind of use within some of these more residentially focused place types? Or like you're saying, do we show um, some kind of residential as a supporting use within this light industrial area?
I think we need to accommodate for it because it is more of like the future of how people work these days. And,
Right.
And so, you know, if you're talking about, as was referenced before, you know, we need to be thinking about the future and not just what's existing today. And I do think there's a lot of mix of residential and workplaces, whether they be like manufacturing, light industrial, whatever you want to call it, or galleries are one example. That's a business enterprise, and there's been a predominance of a lot of people converting those old warehouses into living spaces, and that we've seen already happening. So just, we need to figure out how to accommodate that type of lifestyle, because that's really part of a growing type of, you know, it's kind of arts and innovation culture.
Right. And so that's definitely something we can work with staff, I think, to decide, and then with you all after we've kind of been able to workshop it is, does that kind of trend, because we are seeing it in other communities too, right? Where these outmoded industrial areas are definitely transitioning away because the market's not there for the employment kind of driving things. It requires those entrepreneurs and folks to come in. Do those stay as part of like an industrial type place type? And then that's part of that transition to something outside of that place type, or do those become part of that other place type next door that's maybe residential with some of those transition uses inside?
Yeah, I'd love Kristen, I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, but I would love your perspective on this because you live in this space a little bit, and you have a little bit more global experience than I do, but I would love to have your perspective on that trend that I've seen and I know you have seen. And I think there is a big move towards live work kind of environments.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're literally, that's what we do here in our office. So, but we're kind of in a commercial area, but on the edge of residential as well. And so, as you're talking through this, I was thinking that was definitely something that we are going to have to consider and accommodate, because you're right. This is kind of where people are headed and what these things are looking like. And, you know, how do you accommodate for it without it becoming opening the door for something that's not good in the neighborhood? And so I think that's part of what we'll be doing over the next few weeks, is really working through what that looks like.
And this is great discussion. Let's go ahead and let Mr. Nolan get through the rest of his presentation, then we can jump back to that.
Well, I mean, that's really it. I mean, so we, I had this summary slide here that kind of shows all the, this summary slide shows all of the kind of supporting and primary. So primary being the black solid dots and supporting being the hollow white dots. That kind of just shows you the mix across the board, with the place types being on the left and the uses kind of coming across the top. This one harder to digest, obviously, in a PowerPoint. So I'm happy we'll be sharing this Miro link like we did before, so you all can continue to comment and review.
Great.
Another comment or question I have is entertainment districts. I mean, that seems to be a hot topic in Dallas. And how do we address those kinds of issues? Because there's a big overlay on entertainment districts and residential neighborhoods, a lot of conflict there.
Yeah, I see that as being a trend that's impacting some of these commercial kind of focused place types, where how do we, I mean, just because we're showing kind of an existing area flagged here, doesn't mean that's what we're talking about maintaining moving forward. To your comment earlier, it's more like what are the trends impacting these types of places, and how do we accommodate those moving forward? So yeah, how do we take outmoded commercial space and reposition it with additional plazas and ways of kind of encouraging interaction and kind of street life? Those are things that can definitely find their way into these place types descriptions once we start moving towards and thinking about kind of the future and how we want to accommodate that change.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Nolan, for your presentation. We'll move on to questions from members of the body. Now, Commissioner Anderson, I see your hand up, so have at it.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chair. Along those same lines as Linda and Krista have been kind of going down, I'm wondering, are we thinking about what those, so if we're looking at residential communities and how to not impact them or to help them move into the right direction, are we thinking about what would help a community, a residential community, sustain itself? What kind of amenities would be needed in order to have that kind of community of the future that we're looking for? And what kinds of constructs in terms of employment and amenities should go there that we can plan in order to transform these communities into the ways that we want to transform them? When we talk about other communities, we talk about the surrounding amenities that help support those communities and help them move in the directions they want to move. But we don't talk about that when we're speaking of Southern sector communities and residences and what they need in order to have fun, live, work, learn, play. So considering there's a large amount of contiguous land, can we begin to think about live, work, learn, play scenarios that accompany the housing that we know we have a shortage of? So when we build that housing, we don't have another problem of being concentrated with housing, especially in the southern sector, where we end up making the southern sector the service corridor as opposed to being an equal part of the city. You guys hear all that?
I could hear it. I'm not sure about the other folks online.
I heard it. It sounded loud
So I
and
can
clear.
say that,
You Miss Gillis? Sure.
it's just, I don't know who wanted to respond to that, but I'll just have in that, yes, those are things that we can consider. And what we're asking is really to think about the place types that are so far, the draft place types that we so far have. Are there components enough within the draft place types that will accommodate these questions, right? And in general, they're still iterative and we're working through them. But then I think the question is, where in the city are those areas most appropriate? Or any given place type or any scenario that we're talking about, from, a mixed use scenario or a transition scenario, is the question that will happen is, where do we then place them on the map? That makes sense. There may be existing areas that we're just confirming that that's the appropriate land use. There may be undeveloped areas that we are charting new territory for and new guidance. And there may be some areas where we want to say this area needs an absolute change. But we want to make sure that the place types that are presented reflect enough of Dallas again, we have to remember, we're at a very high level here. We are talking from a very high level citywide perspective. Do those draft place types provide enough guidance to accommodate or to reflect the guidance the land use guidance that we want to put forth for the City of Dallas?
I think that covers it. That's exactly what I'm kind of referring to. I think you hit it right on the head. It's just consideration of all of those elements when we're thinking about any one of those communities, to make sure that we kind of cover all those bases. So I appreciate that thought pattern, and that's exactly what I was kind of referring to.
And
thank you, Ms. Gillis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure, thank you for the question. And one brief thing that I did want to state is that for these because of the scale of these place types and the citywide perspective and the very high level view, there aren't going to be many, if any, place types that are just saying one single use is appropriate here. Most of them are going to be thinking about, yes, this is the primary use in this area. Some of them may be very mixed. Some of them at minimum, though, maybe, yes, this is going to be the overall primary use in this area. This is the priority. However, if there are certain circumstances to support that primary use, we should figure out areas where these other more ancillary uses or secondary uses can be supported and how they can sort of function harmoniously.
Thank you, Ms. Gillis. I see Mr. Goldstein has his hand up. I'll come to you next.
Thank you, Chair Rubin. This is a great discussion, lots of important topics, and wanted to get back for a second to a topic that came up briefly in the existing conditions presentation last month. And that had to do with kind of Dallas and our city being car-centric. And I think that kind of thinking about this particular topic hits on two huge issues, obviously the equity, but also the environmental. And more specifically, talking about what's becoming more and more commonplace here in Dallas, unfortunately, and across the country, are some of these flooding instances that have to do as we continue to develop in the city, the nature of our surfaces, impervious surfaces, flood mitigation. So I guess my first question is there some kind of map or data that we could provide that might identify areas of the city where this is an issue? And then the second part kind of relates to some of the images. Today's were much better, but in the presentation last month, I think it's slide number 34, on the rural residential and even the urban residential, slide 36, that there's not much green in those slides, and particularly, so I guess my point is that paying attention to those images as guidance, as standards that we've been talking about, I think the imagery is going to be really important. So for instance, when we're showing rural residential, if you look at slide 34 on the right, it's almost entirely paved. And while that might be a reality, I just want to clarify, the goal here, I think, is to provide guidance, to provide standards of what we hope the city will become. So I guess two parts. Again, one, flood mitigation and impervious surfaces. Can we provide data of that sort? And also the importance of those images as kind of guidelines.
To your first question, yes. And so there are a series of maps that are included in the existing conditions report that Lawrence will be sending out this afternoon to you all, so you can see that updated report, including some of the environmental considerations, the flooding issues, the impervious cover. So that will be included. And you'll get that information by the end of the day today. And the second one, absolutely agree. I think how we graphically tell the story is critically important as well. So we encourage you to flag those issues as well. These are example graphics at this point, but obviously we want to make sure that that is top of mind as well, because, I mean, to be perfectly frank, after, writing many plans, we know that there's a very large chunk of the population, all of us included, that don't read the plans, but like to look through it and see, get a nod to what the recommendation and what the guidance is through those graphics and images. So point very well taken.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up on that, I know as architects, we're visually oriented, and so looking for those images is our guidelines. And then, I want to say too that along this line, part of the discussion in West Oak Cliff with these auto-centric businesses that came into question is that we can do both. We can have standards for what these street experiences are like without changing the uses. If we're just kind of have standards about what we want our streets to be like.
Oh, absolutely. And there is, there's a ton of precedence throughout the country. And I think even in Dallas, as I walk through Dallas, there really is a lot of precedence. And I think it'll be helpful to bring forward those images where we can show that you can have both, and you can do both, and giving some real life examples.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. Commissioner Carpenter?
Yes, looking at the two industrial place types, and I'm thinking that perhaps we need some expansion there, because while I get flexible industry innovation for the more modern, new kinds of things that are coming along, the maker spaces, I'm not sure that everything else falls under industrial hub. I know we're getting, warehousing, logistics, inland port type, places emerging in town that have, they're almost exclusively warehouses and truck stops and truck parking lots. And, while there could be some supportive accompanying uses, I'm not sure they fall exactly. I mean, it seems to me that's a distinct type that doesn't fall under either of those categories. And then when you have industrial hub, which is like almost anything other than flexible industry, where are you going to draw the line between, the cleaner types of industry, and when you get into things like packing plants and metal plating and metal salvage and waste management and chemical factories and asphalt and concrete batch plants, concrete crushing, auto salvage, auto pound, motor vehicle salvage, diesel truck conversion, the types of industries that are clustered, say, in District 6 around Luna and Ryan and Spangler and California Crossing, those are uses that require really special consideration, and they are very difficult to co-locate with other type, whether they're totally inappropriate for residential, but even some of the lighter industrial. So I'm just thinking that perhaps these two industry place types are not sufficient.
Mr. Dillon, you're muted, I think.
Thank you. I'd say on the second point, those kind of the noxious industrial uses. To me, that could be dealt with those locational standards within the place type. So within the industrial hub, you could say, these types of uses need to be located in areas away from these other uses. Like you can establish kind of standards within the place type that say kind of where those should be located and kind of how they should be buffered from everything, even within the place type. To your point, they definitely should not be located on the edges next to anything that is residential. But that can be stated within kind of the standards for that place type. And we can definitely, I think, consider adding another industrial or employment focused place type. I think we just need to agree with staff and then come back to you all with going to be what that appropriate mix is and what does that gradation look like.
And I may just jump in here and say, from my perspective, I think a little bit more gradation on the industrial side may help both at the most noxious end, so there's not, confusion about what falls in this broad industrial hub category, so we can have good discussions about where an industrial hub versus more noxious industrial uses. And that's obviously probably not the right term for that. And then on the other end, I do think that the industrial typology and that vernacular is very important when we consider what's appropriate for adjacency to residential. So as we look at things on the very light end that would probably be classified as industrial under existing zoning, we may need to rethink whether those fall under the industrial heading, period, or if those if there's some of the more new, innovative, less disruptive uses do properly fall within commercial for potential suggestions about code rewrite and that sort of thing down the road. That's just my 2 cents. Mr. Lopez? I think we're going to go to Mr. Lopez. I'll come back to you, Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Gillis, thank you for your explanation on place types. I think it really put it in perspective here, at least for me. A suggestion here is, how do we manage the change? I see this very analogous to redistricting, because I was on the redistricting commission, and you can create this mass hysteria say if the place type changes from suburban residential neighborhood to, urban residential neighborhood, what does that truly mean for a neighborhood and its residents? We cannot create this mass hysteria when maybe in actuality nothing changes in that neighborhood. But what my suggestion is, how do we create talking points that can not only just educate the commissioners, but the communities themselves on how this change management can potentially work. Sometimes we have to expand the uses within a certain community, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we have to learn how to accept this change that is happening in our communities now. But from a talking perspective, from a commissioner's perspective, I think these talking points could be incredibly helpful as we deal with community members, as we deal with nonprofits, as we deal with neighborhood associations and different associations. Because my concern is that the messaging can get very convoluted very quickly if we're not all on the same page. Comment.
Completely agree. Although my question is, we can't create mass chaos. But no, to your point, I think that's, it's a really important point, and that's part of this piece as well. So we're reaching out to the Comprehensive Land Use Committee, but simultaneously, we're also setting up all of these community meetings as well to have these same type of conversations within different communities. To start actually talking about place types and what they are, because I think we have a pretty high, benchmark of, there's a lot of work to be done from an education perspective, because this is somewhat of a new concept for Dallas. And, just really starting to work with people about what this does and what this doesn't. So one of the things that we do is we've been talking about a lot is we also need sort of the why presentation, which we have, which are those top high-level talking points in 5 to 10 minutes, going out to anybody. Why this land use plan? Why are we doing this? Why Forward Dallas? How does this impact you in your daily life? I think one of the things that we have to remind people too is the vast majority of the city, there's most likely going to be no recommended change. Some of the areas in the city, we're going to be recommending change in areas where people have been asking for change for a long time. In West Dallas, in South, there's been a lot of those requests. So this is actually responding to those requests that we've been hearing for years and years and years. The areas I think really where there may be some adjustments, there's going to be two things. Either one, if we think that the change might be so significant that that might create another level of where we're going to have to take it down to either a corridor plan or a neighborhood plan and do more intensive planning for that area. Provide a general framework, but the more intensive detailed plan. And then we also have to remember and remind people, any proposed changes means that there's going to have to be a followed up zoning case. And that is a whole separate public process to work out those details. This just hovers over as a big picture guidance. As we get into the weeds with the zoning, it's a whole separate. This land use doesn't change anything automatically. A land use plan doesn't automatically, it has to be re-implemented with zoning, and that's a whole separate process to work out those details.
What I've learned from the redistricting process is that my fellow citizens from Dallas, when you contemplate change, they're going to be calling you.
Absolutely.
And so we have to be prepared for that. We have to have our talking points correct. And so I applaud you for your efforts. This chart right here, 45, makes so much sense to me. And I think that is probably the basis of everything we do. This chart right here on 45. So love it. Love what you're doing. Thank you. Go forth and do great work.
I'm injured.
Do you have another question, Commissioner Carpenter? I saw someone's hand up online. Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm wondering if we can create, or if it makes sense, to think about a research and an R&D district that is somewhat similar to industrial, but we create various uses that would accompany, I guess, several place types that then helps us with a missing middle of economy, so to speak, and begins to push those communities in a particular direction. I know that my community, being in Southern Oak Cliff, would love to have a research and development corridor that capitalizes on what's already zoned as industrial, the limited amount of industrial that we have, but to revisit it to be a component of where the community is going in the future. And I think it could be defined as research and development that allows it to be something different than those heavy uses of, stack plants and concrete batches and all of that. And I'm thinking more of 3D printing, laser cutting, even advanced manufacturing for single family houses, so a housing factory, and computer components and things that don't necessarily have an environmental impact, but they are an advanced manufacturing or an industrial process. But if we could then create a lane that is under R&D, I think that could help. If there's not already a lane that encompasses R&D, that could help our conversation. And that's all.
Great. Thanks, Commissioner Anderson. Any other questions or comments for staff? I know they all value y'all's input as they continue to refine the place types. Mr. Goldstein?
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Lopez's observations about his experiences in change management. I think that's an excellent point that we need to pay close attention to. And I totally agree that it's kind of an educational mission, before this gets rolled out, to help educate the public. And I'm going to put my DISD educator cap on for a second and just say that in terms of inclusivity, we can certainly get our high school students to be ambassadors and teach them. This is impacting their future, and we do want to hear their voices. And also higher education, Paul Quinn and SMU and UNT. I think as inclusive as we can be, the more success that we'll have.
Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. Members, any additional questions, comments? Can't see all of you online, so feel free to pipe up. Ms. McMahon.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I guess mine is not related to the work that we did today or the review that we had today. It's really more about the direction of this body and exactly what our role is. So we spent the early part of this year looking at specific area plans. And now it appears to me, and to correct me if I'm wrong, it now appears that we're getting into the real meat of the work that we're here for. And I'm just trying to make sure that I'm understanding what the expectation is, because while I think the area planning review process was very educational for us, because we all, I think, learned an awful lot about the issues relating to planning within these communities. This, to me, is what we are planning on being engaged in, is really making sure that the direction in a more global sense is where we're supposed to be going, and what our opinions are about those and how that fits into what we think the city of Dallas needs to look like in the future. And so with that being my overarching question, the next question I have is exactly what do you see the pace and the content being going forward between now and the end of the year? Because as I recall back on the calendar and the schedule, there's a pretty aggressive schedule to get things before council, or at least before committees before the end of the year. And this is September, and we're still, to me, in the very beginning stages of understanding what we're here for. So could you please elaborate on expectations? And if I'm out of line, sorry, but I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding exactly what we need to accomplish in the time frame that's required.
That's a great question, Ms. McMahon, and I'll let staff take a first stab at it, and I have some comments there as well.
Yeah, so I think, yes, absolutely, we're getting into the meat and potatoes of the committee's work. And we will, so what, you're sort of our first line of defense from the citywide policymakers, decision makers, appointed officials, thinking about this document while we're simultaneously working with the community as well to get this word out. So we are really going to be stepping up the pace on bringing things to you for consideration and your feedback on those different iterations that we bring to you. As far as the schedule, we won't be going to committees, any council committees by the end of the year. We are gearing up now for a second big round of engagement to start talking about place types within the community, to get people to start, to be doing that specific educational piece and what place types mean and where they potentially could make sense, where it resonates with people in their own communities, the different place types, and where some of those issue areas are that haven't already been identified. So that's going to be happening through the end of the year. We're also having individual meetings again with council members to start, making sure that they're continually up to speed on this as well, and providing us with feedback on who else within their districts they'd like us to be talking to as well, and some of the issues within their districts, so we can start weaving that together from a citywide perspective. And Lawrence, I don't know if you had any more specific details on schedules that you wanted to provide for timeline.
Right, so in terms of timeline, just like Andrew mentioned, we'll be going in front of the boards likely end of the first quarter of next year. So you all are basically testing and talking through these points with you all first before we go out to community, before we go out to these boards, similar to what we did in March and May with the engagement report. Have you all look at it, give feedback, and then we go out to community with that feedback and that analysis they provided us. So we give that to the community as well. So everything that Andrew mentioned, I was going to say too, but she covered that pretty well.
So when you mention boards, is that CPC? What bodies actually, beyond the community meetings,
yes,
what
so
bodies are you presenting to?
CPC would be one of those boards after you all too as well. And then ultimately, in the summer of 2023, we'll be going in front of council as well.
And if I may, just a brief remark, this is, to my understanding, I wasn't around in 2006, the last time we did a comp plan rewrite. This is the first time that we've had a committee of the Plan Commission constituted like this, overlooking or taking such a role in a comprehensive plan rewrite. So, when CPC conceived of this committee and rewrote its rules to create this committee, it was doing this for the first time, and a key goal of this committee was to take a significant role in the comp plan rewrite. And we also identified oversight of the area planning process, because these area plans do roll up into the comp plan. I don't know if anyone envisioned that the first area plan that we would deal with would necessarily be so challenging to work through, to say the least. I think everyone's understanding was that this body's primary role would be to work on the comp plan rewrite, but we got we had an area plan placed in front of us that was challenging to work through. And I think there may be one or two area plans outstanding. I don't think that they, knock on wood, will be as controversial as the last one. But if we need to sort of rebalance, what the committee's role is, of area plans versus comp plan, that is certainly something that we can look at the CPC level to make sure that we are getting the work product out on the comp plan that we need in time. And I see Ms. Gillis at the microphone.
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify that so really the committee was established to look at any land use policies that are going through the city. So I think we had the timing of things have been interesting because up until this point, or up until the point of, say, the area plan, West Oak Cliff and Forward Dallas kicking off, the city hadn't really brought forward the traditional land use plans for consideration in a while. So the timing just sort of became interesting that we had this area plan with a land use component. We had this committee established, and the committee was established to look at all land use considerations within the city. So any type of plan that would go through that, and as Chair Rubin said, you know, if we have to look at adjusting those, it's sort of the role of this committee, I think we can do that, but that's sort of where bringing the area plans to you came into play, because we are charged with anything now that has a land use component, that we first bring it through this committee before it goes on to CPC.
And when you say anything with a land use component, you mean a plan?
A land use
Yeah,
plan.
not zoning changes, not
No,
code
a
amendments.
traditional land use plan that is going to establish land use policy, and that the intent is that the city council is going to adopt that land use plan.
Thanks to add to that. Thanks to add to that, moving forward in the future after Forward Dallas gets adopted and other smaller area plans, neighborhood plans come forward, this body is meant to look at those plans and comes with Forward Dallas to see how that matches or what needs to change based on what was recommended from Forward Dallas.
And I think once Forward Dallas, you know, ultimately gets implemented or passed, I think there will also be a discussion about how this committee is constituted, you know, so it continues to be efficient. You know, I think everyone who served on this committee was primarily sold on it because of their role. You know, they would play in Forward Dallas. So we'll certainly continue to evaluate how this committee moves forward and in what form after Forward Dallas is put into place. Ms. McMahon?
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm clear. Well, first of all, what do we anticipate looking at next month? Because I think we all have a good understanding of place types. And then secondarily, I know there were a couple of other area plans that are going on. The South Dallas Fair Park area plan, I know staff is well aware of what a show that is and how contentious it is. I mean, frankly, from my experience in sitting in those meetings, it makes the West Oak Cliff area plan look like kindergarten. So I don't know whether that's planned for review. At what level, if we agree to a total land use that council agrees to, and those communities want to have a specific area plan, at what level does the city just say, this is the approved area plan and we're going to comply with that for your neighborhood? Is it ever going to be that level of concreteness with some flexibility, or is it just going to always be, a contentious situation in each community? And I know you can't answer a question that hasn't been posed by a community yet, but just trying to forecast what we anticipate in the future.
To answer your first question, so the next time we do meet, we'll be looking at all these place types that we had showed you all today on a map and trying to identify areas in the city that could possibly change based on your input, our analyses, and feedback from the community. So that's going to be a workshop where we kind of look at the place types spatially and get better understanding in terms of what areas probably need to change relative to that. And going to your second question, the Planning and Urban Design Department, we're working on the process in terms of integrating past plans, current plans that are being initiated by the community. So that's currently something that Andrea is heading up with her team, and we'll be relaying that. I'm not sure it's next year or probably after Forward Dallas, to be able to incorporate that feedback, land use specific to what we're doing with Forward Dallas at the city. So our intent is to have a community's vision as part of our land use documentation. So we're working on different ways of integrating and incorporating what they have to say in the community to what we have with Forward Dallas.
Very helpful.
Members, any additional questions for staff or Mr. Nolan? Not Nolan, sorry.
I had a question Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
I had a question about the Board of Adjustments, as it relates to this process and how they are engaged in this process. Because I mean, if variances come up all the time and they're not complying with, what we're trying to accomplish here, then what's the point?
So Board of Adjustments gets at issues that are way deeper in the weeds than the land use, especially the citywide land use plan. So there shouldn't be any recommendations in the citywide land use plan that necessarily impact very directly the Board of Adjustment, because we're thinking about fences, we're thinking about, sheds and things like that. If we were to do something like a neighborhood plan where we are going to look very detailed parcel by parcel that gets followed up through, after Forward Dallas, there may be more implications with that because it's more detailed. But at this level, there isn't a lot of intersection with issues at BDA.
Okay, thank you.
And he may have popped on earlier, but I just saw Mr. Bullard, and it's 10:09 a.m. Mr. Bullard. Any other questions for staff or Mr. Nolan? Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for your great questions and feedback for staff today. Thank you, Mr. Gu, Ms. Gillis, Mr. Nolan, for your excellent presentation and answers to all of our questions. And I look forward to seeing everyone at our next meeting. And unless anyone has anything else, we can adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Okay, yeah, we have a motion to adjourn by Commissioner Anderson, seconded by Commissioner Carpenter. Motion is all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. The motion carries, and we are adjourned at 10:10 a.m. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.